National Cannabis Policy Summit. It's great to be back. And it's great to be back with these individuals to my left. We're going to dig in and discuss some of these very important issues that really impact licensed, non-licensed, ancillary, vaguely related businesses. But before we jump in, I do want to do some introductions. So why don't we start with you, Kaylee, and then we'll go down the line and just give us a brief introduction of who you are and how you found yourself here today.
Absolutely. So my name is Kaylee Wilder. I am the CEO and co-founder of Estro Hayes, Inc. We are a digital media company all about bringing resources and information to communities of color, in particular women of color, to empower them to, get into this business and embrace the lifestyle.
Thank you, Ricardo. My name is Dustin McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for Weedmaps. Weedmaps is the oldest and largest technology company in the cannabis space. My way of being here is through policy, while we do a lot of interaction with government on the right way to organize policy to sufficiently generate enough access for patients. Ultimately, we run off of a technology platform. And as an operator of a technology platform, we have considerable issues with a lot of other technology platforms that tend to oversee ours. That's why I'm here today.
Right on.
And
yeah.
I'm Letha Knott. I'm the executive director of the First Amendment Center at the Freedom Forum Institute, which incidentally is located in this building, so I didn't travel very far to get here. But essentially, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on educating people about how the First Amendment and how free speech and free expression in general work. And part of that mission is that we pay very close attention to the kinds of speech that are allowed and not allowed on social media. Not exactly a First Amendment issue, but an issue that impacts the public conversations we have about everything. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful.
My name is Mike Whiter. I am a producer for Now This. My main focus is Now This Weed. We produce cannabis content, video-driven social video news content, mostly on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, social media stuff.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks very much. And I know I got the brief introduction up front, but I did start The Cannabist at the Denver Post. And now my gig is Grasslands. We're a PR and marketing agency specializing in highly regulated industries, including very much cannabis and hemp. And I also am the host of Cannabis and Now. So it's a podcast from Civilized. Just got picked up for a second season, so give us a subscribe. But we are here discussing cannabis in the crosshairs. I want to start by just kind of laying the groundwork. Where are we? What is the state of the union? Because, we've already talked here today about cannabis journalism, the complexities that exist there with that medium. But so much of modern media at the same time really is social media. It's the App Store. It's how we interact with news so often through the lens of Twitter, Facebook, and that has really become such an important part of the national, international conversation. And here in cannabis, it's red hot and necessary as well because of the complexities there and businesses' page getting banned or shadow banned or just straight up pulled. I have a dear friend who just lost their Instagram page, a great edibles company out of Colorado, and they're really starting from zero, and that is their primary driver of traffic. But if we're starting to talk about the state of the union, where are we right now in mid-2019 as it relates to this subject matter? Dustin, you want to get us started?
Sure. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Ultimately, all of us are up here talking about this issue because we're seeing cannabis businesses, you're seeing individuals who are cannabis consumers or patients having their social media profiles stripped from platforms or their apps compromised in terms of their integrity and utility to customers. There's a wide variety of applications, web pages that have all been censored for the most part, or in some places, as I mentioned, you lose total loss of functionality, compromising patients' ability to identify legal points of sale where they can absolutely obtain medical cannabis. So it's really kind of covering the whole groundwork in terms of how it's affecting cannabis businesses, cannabis industries, and cannabis consumers. It's a pervasive problem that there really isn't a lot of government address to at this point at the federal level, or even by the vast majority of these states who have organized these models. Even in California, we've got the Internet Association, the Tech Caucus, and you've got groups of lawmakers working with folks in the tech industry regularly because of Silicon Valley. There isn't a real appreciation for how those larger tech companies are kind of putting downward pressure and really kind of stifling the growth of the marketplace and stifling consumer access.
Anybody else have anything to add about, kind of bringing us up to date, maybe personal experiences with what's happened, and especially as this relates to social media, App Store, and this industry?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
One thing that is concerning to me, particularly about 2019, the landscape now, is how arbitrary the rules are. I mean, if I know what the rules are, then maybe I can work within a particular framework. But right now, it just seems random when pages are pulled. And that is what's, I think, frustrating for a lot of companies
Right.
that are doing business. Yeah.
Yeah, the popular, you've violated our terms of use.
Right, without giving any kind of specifics, really. Or it's general, but just, there's no rules, really. It's a lot of gray. And we find that a lot in the cannabis industry in general, but in particular, as far as social media is concerned, it's a lot of gray. And advertising, too.
On a very basic foundational level, let's just kind of lay that quick groundwork. Maybe, Mike, you can help us. Why do these businesses, these nonprofit organizations, these influencers, why do they need to be on social media? Why are these channels so essential for them?
Well, social media is important. We need to reach, for now this, our audience is millennials. So we need to reach those millennials, and that's where millennials live, is on social media and on their mobile phones. That's why social media is important. That everybody is on their, not just millennials, everybody is on their phones all the time. And that's where this news that we put out needs to live, so that people can get that and take it and do whatever they want to with it, to advance cannabis laws.
Right. And Lada, can you speak to this too? Because we live in such a vastly different media environment today than even 10 years ago, than even 5 years ago. But why are these social channels so essential to a business, a media organization, a nonprofit organization?
Because social media is the way that we get the word out these days. If you don't exist on social media, I don't want to say that you don't exist, but it just makes everything a lot more difficult. And so it's interesting that because we're sort of reliant on those as like ways to communicate with people, it's important to keep in mind that different social media platforms, they all set their own community guidelines, their rules for what content you can put on it. And they also all have their own advertising guidelines that are even more stringent than their content guidelines. And it's tough because it's given that you're kind of playing by their rules when you're using their platform. As you've mentioned, you can easily lose everything that you've worked towards when they decide you're violating the community policy or the advertising guidelines. And all of these are, by the way, enforced by a combination of algorithms and humans. And so you aren't going to get consistent enforcement. You're going to get some things that get taken off for no reason. The guidelines would say that you can't depict the use of marijuana on Facebook. You can't have ads that sell it, although you can have ads for advocacy and education. But what people have found is that they, to give you an example, last year there was a shadow ban of the California agency that officially regulates marijuana because you're working with an algorithm that was just banning anything with the word cannabis. So that's tricky, putting your faith in social media platforms, even though everyone kind of has to in today's world.
Yeah, that was a fascinating thing when it happened. I mean, that was a government agency whose Facebook page was pulled. Mm-hmm. And you know, I mean, this is not limited to social channels. And of course, it's so much of our world, right? You know, I don't know if any of you get that weekly reminder from your iPhone about how much time you spent on your phone on average per day, but I get that every Sunday and it's terrifying. But you know, it's social media without a doubt, and they have this power because they have an ownership of what you're putting out there. But it's also the App Store. And not just Apple, it's Google, it's other channels. Dustin, I know that you guys face this regularly. I wrote a page one story for the Denver Post back in 2015, I believe. Back when Weed Maps, Massroots, a lot of those early adopter apps were having problems pushing through updates. So can you talk about how this challenge also applies to beyond social media?
Of course, yeah. On the social media side, I think from a policy side, just to jump on that real quick, there's a lot of tools that you have compromised as well. If you're ultimately running campaigns and you're trying to sway voters and you're driving that message to their constituents at them trying to use social media platforms, doing Facebook ad buys, doing any kind of ad buys across those platforms, you're largely kept from the ability to do that by these platforms. But jumping into the information piece, I think now this hit it dead on. We're talking about information delivery, really, ultimately through these platforms. And Weed Maps, I think you have the analogy of not only information that needs to be delivered out to our customers and to our clients that runs through our app, but you're also compromising delivery itself, of delivery of cannabis to patients. And that's something that I want to focus on a little bit. So in our app, we have a feature called WM Orders. Through the Orders platform, customers who are patients can place an order for pickup. There aren't enough retail access storefronts across America, folks. You've got 47 states with some form of legal access online, but very few of them have sufficient retail density to satisfy patient or consumer demand, meaning that the largest portion of the market will still remain illegal until electeds wake up to the fact that they need to create a larger legal market than there is an illegal market. In that environment, what you have for patients is an atmosphere where if I go to a dispensary to access cannabis for medicine, I have to wait in a long line most times. It can be a difficult thing to go to initially for a patient because of their physical health, and it can also be a problem once you get there. So pickup really is a savior for a lot of patients as they try to access the limited number of legal storefronts that exist in places like California. Now, through the App Store, we've had various components of that pickup mechanism that have been disabled. And Apple has offered all kinds of different rationale to that, but to the point raised by a number of folks across this panel, the rules set by Apple, whether they're advertising rules or whether they're rules related to content, there is no rule book, folks. And if there is a rule book, Apple's not showing it to us, and they're sure as heck not offering any kind of consistent interpretation of those rules. In that atmosphere, all of the work that we try to do to expand legal access, safe and legal access to patients is compromised. And it's not just our work. It's the work of cultivators, it's the work of manufacturers, it's the work of distributors, it's the work of testing labs, it's the work of retailers, it's the work of everybody across this industry that we're all trying to do together to build a functioning regulated marketplace. All of that is compromised by these technology platforms that seemingly are beyond government regulation at this point.
Lada, can you kind of walk us through this? Because there's issues of federal illegality, of course, but then we also can't help but think about censorship and free speech, you know? So what's happening in here? Is this happening primarily because it's still federally illegal, marijuana is?
Kind of. It's a really confusing legal landscape right now, as I'm sure everybody's aware. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that you've got policies about content and you've got policies about advertising, each platform does. And when it comes to content, usually if you're like discussing, say, the benefits of marijuana, that should be allowed. Most of the content rules would allow things like that, but and this is where it gets dicey, like you can't, for like say Facebook, you can't depict the usage of it, which is really strange, but you know, there's certain things where you are allowed to talk about it, you are allowed to advocate for it, or at least you're supposed to be. Like I said, the enforcement of this can be kind of off kilter. But with the advertising policies, each state has different advertising policies and each state has different legal standards for cannabis right now. And essentially Facebook and Google and the rest of them are sort of erring on the side of banning more stuff because they don't want to run afoul of anything. They don't want people doing anything that's illegal in a particular jurisdiction because they don't want to be regulated by the government. They're trying to avoid that. And so they're basically like, well, let's just ban it just in case. We don't really want somebody to say we're facilitating illegal activity. That's something that they're I'd say terrified of. And so that's why they're sort of leaning towards banning more advertisements or blocking more people from purchasing advertisements. And that kind of informs the rule book and everything that they do there.
Yeah, I remember early days, pre-adult use even, you know, certainly social media channels were a very popular way for dealers to sell product, you know, let people know where they're going to be, what it's going, you know, what the going rate might be. You know, we at Grasslands, we do run social media for a number of businesses, and we have a list of best practices. And I'll throw some of those things out there, and I'd love some feedback from the client or from the panel. But one of the things we tell clients is just don't talk about prices, don't talk about addresses. Let's keep these things, you know, if they want to find that, they can find that on Weed Maps, they can find that on your website, on your owned media. But for your Instagram channel, let's just not talk about those things, because that generally is something that we've learned is something that gets the attention of those Instagram regulators that are paying close attention to you because they know exactly what you're doing, in part because of the hashtags you're using, in part because they just know, even though there's you know, millions of Instagram accounts. But I wonder if those kinds of best practices ring true with any of you, but also what your own best practices are. Kaylee, maybe you can share some of yours with us.
Sure. So early on, before we had our podcast and we first started, we definitely were a lot more loose in, you know, our social media presence. A big part of what Estro Haze is about is destigmatizing use, to be a platform where we can be out and proud as Black women and say we are cannabis consumers. It's fine. You can be a cannabis consumer too. We stepped out to do that. So that usage sometimes gets tagged, you know, and a big part of that is showing our face, smoking or eating edibles or whatever. So we've had to get very creative in the way we tell stories. And that's kind of like our best practices. We don't promote selling of the product in any kind of way. We do talk about usage. We really only post certain things on our stories. We've been experimenting a lot, but that's kind of, we just had to get really creative in our storytelling and not be as explicit in it, I guess.
I'm sure. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the more wiggle room you can leave yourself in those social channels is probably the better. But anybody else on the panel have anything to add there in terms of what you either practice or what you would recommend others practice?
Well, we don't necessarily make advertisements for Now This. We tell stories, and we give people the news, right? In a video format. To my knowledge, we haven't had any issues being pulled from Facebook or anything like that. Our only real issue is, obviously, the issue everybody else here has is placing ads and targeting on social media.
Sponsoring posts.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you guys have not been able to do that.
You know, it's hit and miss. There are some posts, the CBD explainer that we did with you actually had an ad on it. So there, you know, there are some cannabis posts that'll have ads on them. No idea why. No idea like why they say yes to one and no to another. It's just, it's up to Facebook really, which is confusing as hell for everyone.
Yeah, you know, it takes me back to my editorial days. As we were starting The Cannabist, as we were reporting on the world's first implementation of adult use in Colorado, and certainly trying to sponsor posts, trying to target specific audiences of readers who we felt would care about this information. We are not plant touching, we are not license holding, we are not any of these things, and yet it was always a crapshoot. And we got turned down more than we got okayed, and that was really frustrating. I'm guessing you guys have played around in that pool as well, Kaylee.
Yeah, definitely. Some posts get approved, and slowly, none of our posts have been approved now. We haven't been banned from it necessarily, but lately they haven't approved any of the posts that we've submitted. So it's arbitrary again.
Yeah, we just made these, we made some fun handmade merch, some hand screen printed incense packets, packed them up. We gave them to some clients and prospects, but it was a wonderful process that we did with some of our creative partners and made a pretty thoughtful Instagram post about it, tried to put some money behind it, doesn't mention anything anywhere, cannabis, marijuana, hemp, and it definitely got turned down. I appealed 2 weeks ago. Got turned down, no explanation whatsoever. We're not a plant-touching business. We work with other industries in addition to cannabis and hemp, including technology and traditional healthcare, and that is not still not working for us. Dustin, Lata, can you maybe speak to why this doesn't only apply to license holders? It's also these ancillary businesses that happen to work with the industry as well.
I'm going to leave that one to you. I have no idea why that arbitrary method of application exists.
Because, you were saying that the rule book is not very clear to people and the guidelines aren't very clear. I think I don't think that there's necessarily like an internal rule book that says exactly what you should ban. That's the problem, right? The policy that says, don't promote something illegal or ban posts that actually refer to the sale of marijuana or might lead to that. That's really vague. And the two things that you have enforcing this vague policy are computers and people. And so they might just have seen that and been like, I don't know, just to err on the safe side, I'm just going to ban that post, Or for all I know, a computer did that. And it's, although the visual recognition probably wouldn't have been good enough. It was probably a person. But, you have that. And I think the reason why the rule book is vague, it's a bit intentional because you'll see that with social media platforms and their policies about ads, about content, they change pretty frequently. It's kind of like every time there's a big public outcry about something, they'll shift it. To give you an example, not cannabis related, Facebook had a policy saying that you could not post something that would depict child nudity, which is fair. And then there was that famous photo from the Vietnam War of the girl running from the napalm fire, and it does depict child nudity. So of course the Facebook algorithm or human moderator immediately took it down, and there was an outcry that this famous, very newsworthy photograph was removed. So now their policy about child nudity says something like, child nudity is banned unless it is related to a very significant journalistic moment. You get the idea. This really just ends up developing as it goes along. And so I think that is actually why the policy is vague, because they're not really sure what the outlines of it are either. It's very case by case.
I thought what you said earlier about these businesses themselves trying to avoid regulation was really poignant. I think especially we saw Zuckerberg, what was that, last year, testifying? And you can just tell he does not want them in his business, because he just started this business in his dorm room, Senator. How many times did we hear that? And he does not want those regulators in his business. And so there is probably this hypersensitivity to all of this. But one thing I've noticed, and I've been paying close attention to this since 2013, is that there has been progress. Back then, it seemed like nobody was getting boosted posts through, lots more pulled accounts. I guess shadow bans maybe have increased, but at least from my position, I've seen progress in these last 5-6 years on this subject matter. It's slight, it's still nebulous, and there's not a lot of guidance that they're giving us, but it seems like they're letting certain CBD companies boost posts. So I guess I'll put that question to the panel. Are you seeing progress, or have you seen progress in the last year and the last 5 years? Dustin, maybe starting with you, especially since Weed Maps is a giant in this space, and all of these channels are mammothly important to you guys. For sure, we have not seen progress. You have or no? We have not. You've not seen it? If anything, it's gotten worse, particularly as I think there are expansions to applications that have been developed for cannabis businesses. I'll give you another example. So not only do we conduct digital advertising through an online platform, but we also build and sell software to industry
participants. One of those software programs is actually compliant delivery software. So that software, really, by facilitating safe and legal access through delivery, you're doing another solid for patients by giving them a way to receive cannabis without having to leave their homes. So it's a preferable model than storefront retail, or at least ought to be joined with storefront retail from a policy standpoint. But delivery fails to function appropriately for patients when they're unable to use it correctly, and the features associated with that on apps and platforms are ultimately dismantled or disabled. But the other challenge, I think, really is as you go about making some of these modifications to some of these tools and features that are really designed to facilitate broader patient access, those things are being compromised by this ever-changing series of policies. There seems to be greater reluctance, and perhaps that's exactly it. Maybe we're running up against sort of new policy for Apple, and they're trying to figure out, how do we balance this? And there's not enough public outcry about it for them to retreat into a position of having to establish some kind of functional policy for folks who are in the space. But we have not seen any real progress.
And so when you say you've not seen real progress, is that specifically on the App Store front, or does that also apply to how the social channels are treating your social platforms and
it's both.
profiles?
It's both, absolutely. Like you say, it's not just Weedmaps. Obviously, it's the websites, it's the social media accounts of other folks on this panel, of other folks in this room who are involved either on the business side or the consumer side. I think everyone really has fallen subject to the same issues, perhaps more pervasive platform that might be monitored more heavily and more regularly.
You think?
So certainly we're a larger target, and we're going to experience more issues, and we're driving this directly and aggressively at these platforms as we build out and expand our scope.
Mike, I'm curious, I know you and I have talked a little bit about this. Now this has a number of channels. Now this weed, politics, her focuses on women's issues. Are your various Now This platforms treated differently by these social networks?
Aside from being able to boost posts and target posts, no, we're not treated any differently at all from the other channels.
And that's especially important for you because, granted, Now This has a website, but nobody watches Now This content on the website. Now This lives and breathes on social channels, so you guys depend on that access.
Yep.
Interesting. So the only difference is that Now This Weed cannot always sponsor posts. The other channels don't have that problem.
Correct. You know, the other channels actually help us get our content out there by you know, cross-posting and sharing. You know, when a Now This Weed story about, you know, something that's going on with a politician is cross-posted to the politics page, it blows up because the politics page has an incredible following that's very engaged, and that, you know, that's engagement's everything on social media. So, you know, no, we're not treated any differently than the other channels.
Well, I'd like to talk about this now too, because we keep mentioning that the rules are nebulous and they don't really open that up. And that doesn't matter if you are the holder of the account, if you're a journalist calling and asking them to explain why something is happening. I've had conversations with a lot of these networks and businesses that we're talking about. You know, I've had multiple off-the-record conversations with Apple representatives. They refuse to talk about this on the record, at least with me. And then multiple off-the-record conversations with Facebook, Instagram, as well as Twitter. They talk generally about how this violates terms of use, but I'd love to hear what each of you have heard when you get turned down, when you appeal, whether it's an app or whether it's a social channel, but what are you hearing from these businesses specifically, and then what aren't you hearing that you wish you could hear? Kaylee?
I mean, I got those same kind of responses that we violated the terms of use. When I appeal it, it is kind of that same thing. You violated the terms of use. However, one thing that I find really interesting is that what I've asked is, can you give me the specifics of what I can and cannot do? And it's still vague, to speak to your point. So that's where I get frustrated. A lot of the time, particularly from boosting posts to when we've had a few posts being taken down, it's just really what is it specifically about this post that violated your terms, your community terms? I need to know.
No guidance.
No guidance whatsoever.
I mean, Dustin, this falls directly in your purview, I'm guessing, and I'm guessing that you've had actual conversations with the people behind the messages. What are you hearing?
We have, and our experience is no different than either of yours. Whether it's regardless of the issue, it all comes, whether it's content or whether it's advertising policy, it's always the same explanation. You violated this particular section of that policy. When you seek further explanation of how you violated that and how you could preferably redress that, you're not really giving any clear guidance. Oftentimes you're set on kind of a fool's errand to pull together a bunch of data that you bring back to them and find out that by the time you bring it back to them, even if it's a week later, they've closed your case because they feel like you haven't gotten back to them in time. But they also haven't told you that there's some window that you have to get back to them by. So it's again, completely arbitrary. I think this combination of humans and some kind of algorithm is really kind of failing this industry right now. There's got to be a better way.
Well, and this construct of federal illegality as well is just so immensely frustrating. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is at the core of every single panel up here today. I mean, that's really where so many of the headaches are born and where these frustrations come from. And here you have a substance that's legal in so many states, but illegal at that federal level. And perhaps some of this stems from that, perhaps it does not. But I guess I'm just curious, especially to not just sit up here and not give them the due that they deserve, but do these businesses, talking about Apple and Google, Facebook, Twitter, do they have a legitimate reason to say, you know what, your business is not welcome here? Do they have that legitimate reason right now, given the precariousness of where legality stands? Lada, could we start with you?
I think that their justification for it, or the reason behind it, is that they don't want the regulation that will come if people are engaging in illegal activity. And of course, the difficult thing is, when it's federally illegal, when it's illegal in some states and legal in other states, it's hard to say target your advertisement or your content to just one specific state. It's something, that's the thing about the internet, it's everywhere. So I think that what we've seen is Twitter, for instance, like their ad policies say you can't advertise the selling of cannabis, except you can do it if your ads are directed towards Canada because they legalized it. So I think that we'll definitely see something different if and when there's federal legalization. They're very cautious right now because this is such a strange legal atmosphere. I think that's something where they are trying to play it safe, and that'll be very different as more states legalize, and especially if there's federal legalization.
Is there something beyond that? I mean, these businesses not wanting to be regulated by the federal government is extremely meaningful. But beyond that, is there, some of these state versus federal clashes that we hear? It's like, oh, well, we could lose our federal funding or we could use our federal license. Is there something beyond that these businesses are also thinking about in the back of their mind?
I think they're also in the business of basically, they want you to spend as much time as possible using their platform. And so sometimes they will ban things because they think, well, this content might be offensive to somebody, or things like that. That's usually not their general policy, but you do see that happen. And I don't think it's so much about losing federal funding as it is they want to toe the line on this and sort of avoid that kind of scrutiny that can come when people use these platforms for illegal purposes. Mm-hmm.
I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to it's their business, and the cannabis industry is evolving. It's evolving rapidly, and if Facebook doesn't want to let us put advertisements on our content now, they're going to eventually, and it's our job to continue pumping that content out and putting it in people's faces and changing the landscape of what this looks like, right? So if we just keep putting that content out, eventually they're going to have to change their minds about it, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully, that's the hope. But it's happening quickly. It's happening all across the country. And the more content we put out there, eventually Facebook's going to have to listen and say, hey, maybe we need to put ads on this stuff. We're putting ads on alcohol. We're putting ads on all this other stuff. Why not cannabis too?
Dustin, when you get turned down for an app update by Apple, is there a part of you that understands why they're acting with an overabundance of caution?
There's a part of me that wants to understand.
But no, in the meantime, you're just like, come on, what's your problem?
I think what's frustrating is, as a tech platform that is the company Weedmaps, I mean, we have to do quite a bit to ensure that we really do a lot of due diligence in satisfying regulatory compliance, whether it's at the federal level or state level. There's quite a bit that we have to do, not only with ourselves, but also in helping our clients and our customers. So we have pretty comprehensive application of regulatory compliance from our side. So I think what you really see with companies like Apple basically saying, oh yeah, we're just going to go ahead and wait until the federal government pulls its act together on broader policy reform and descheduling. So basically they're just kind of taking the lazy way out, as opposed to really going through and identifying what policy looks like across all the states that have organized some form of legal access and those that haven't, and really staying on top of the laws to ensure that the folks who are valuable members of their platform, I mean, we're all on their platforms the same as the rest of the consumers that are not in the cannabis space, have the same freedoms and accessibility through those platforms that everyone else does. So in our view, it's a bad policy that they've generated in the way that they've conducted business in this way, and we would like to see an improvement.
It'll be interesting to see, because it's inevitable, right? Federal legalization is going to happen someday. These businesses will start taking your advertisements, your boosted posts and sponsored posts someday. But will there be a facet of these industries, cannabis, hemp, and beyond, that remember these important days when we really needed them to be there for us, and they weren't? And so will we remember that? Do you guys think there's going to be a hangover that once they do allow it, we're going to remember that and maybe choose to spend our ad dollars elsewhere? Or do we need these channels so much that we're just going to need to rely on them regardless? Kaylee?
Well, I think it's our responsibility to also go where the people are, because a big part of what we do is educating people to destigmatize the plant and show them how it can be beneficial for their life in a variety of ways. So we are probably going to have to depend on those platforms if the people are there. I mean, that's just the reality of things.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Anybody have anything else to add there? It's just they hold all of the cards right in this situation, and we're completely at their mercy. Maybe we're running out of time, but I do want to get in one more question. How do we solve this? What are the best steps that we can use as media, as industry, as thought leaders, as consumers, and ultimately so many of us are really consumers and customers of Facebook? Probably more than most other brands in our lives. But what are things that we can do to, ideally be the change that we want to see in the world and lead to this eventual change we know is coming one of these days? Mike?
Just keep pumping the content out. Keep telling the stories. Cannabis is it's a hearts and minds campaign, and we need to change people's minds about what cannabis is and how much it helps people. It's not just adult use. There's medical cannabis, and it's an important thing. My favorite stories to tell are people whose lives were saved by cannabis, because that mirrors my story, and I know how to tell that story. We just keep pumping content out.
But when you talk about trying to change hearts and minds, are you trying to change Mark Zuckerberg's mind, or are you trying to change somebody's mind down the street here in the federal government, because that's where the change needs to happen for this conversation to move forward?
Mark Zuckerberg and politicians, everybody. We need to change everybody's mind. Everybody consumes social media, and that's why we need to keep putting that content on social media.
What about appealing directly to these channels? Is it worth writing letters to these organizations and these businesses?
In some sense, because they're businesses, they do respond to public responses to things and public outrage or outcries. So that is one thing. The other thing, what you said about once they do allow these advertising dollars to go into their industries, should they be forgiven and everything? I think I'm not anti-social media or anti these companies, but they're just businesses, and no business is infallible, and no business is going to be around forever. So I think that, it's important to remember that they're not evil, I don't think, but they're on their side. They're always going to be on their side. They'll take ad dollars from the industry when it becomes profitable and outweighs the risk of them doing so. So I almost think that maybe we shouldn't be so dependent on these pre-existing channels. I mean, part of the promise of the internet was that anybody could create anything. I don't think we need to be so limited sometimes.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. That was just an interesting point. How do we divert attention to our own platforms and not have to depend on? Because that's going to be the big how. We shouldn't be dependent on these platforms, but how do you get the eyeballs off of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my wife, the minute, what was it that broke? Oh, Cambridge Analytica. The minute that news broke, she deleted her Facebook. And I was just like, you are so lucky, because my line of work would never allow me to do that. I can't do that, but I would have done it that day if I didn't rely on it. So that's a great question to the panel. What are the alternatives to supporting these multinational conglomerates that we've developed a certain amount of dependence on?
As you proposed that last question, I was listening to Kaylee respond to it. I was trying to think of where the hell you could go. But I thought you made a great point, Kaylee, that you really have to go where the people are. You have to go where your audience is. And generating some new place to go, I think, is certainly a laudable goal that really is incumbent upon all of us. In the meantime, I think we also all have to do our part to appeal directly to these platforms to improve. We have cases of patients who have shared with us correspondence that they've written directly to Apple saying, oh, you eliminated my ability to identify cannabis dispensaries where I live, and now I can't obtain legal access. Glaucoma patients and a series of other patients have sent us these correspondence. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us also to respond to Apple and to these platforms and let them know that this is a problem, this is unacceptable. As users of their platform, we demand more of them. And so I think it's going to be a little of both.
I'm curious, Dustin, has Weedmaps ever done a letter writing campaign? You guys have such an immediate through line to people who are passionate about these issues. I would imagine that could be relatively, and granted, I don't know that would be fruitful or successful, but I'm sure you guys could lead something like that. Has that ever happened?
It hasn't, but at the same time, while Weedmaps is a very large player in the cannabis space, we are not Apple. It is very much David taking on Goliath. So I think that kind of campaign is certainly compelling. We should talk more about what such a strategy might look like, but taking on that giant is a formidable task.
Yeah, and that makes sense, of course, because they hold the cards, and especially if you want future app updates, which are many in the course of a year, I can see why you wouldn't want to necessarily take them head on.
The strategy to compromise this issue with Apple will be a delicate one.
Well, I think, I think everybody in here, this is an issue that impacts us all. Whether you're looking for quality information or quality product, we all rely on these social channels so much. So regardless of an organized campaign or more by the people, I would absolutely recommend that each of you maybe reach out to the service of your choice and just say, hey, we think that you should be allowing more cannabis advertisements and not be so strict and absurdly discerning when it comes to the regulation of these businesses and their accounts and their social channels and their apps. But in the meantime, I want to thank my panel and thank all of you guys, and I hope it's a great rest of the day here at the National Cannabis Policy Summit. Thanks very much.